Chapter 1. The most beautiful trap I ever walked into. The flowers were peonies. Blush pink and ivory, arranged in clusters so perfect they looked artificial, but they weren't. I touched one as I walked past just to confirm. Real petals. Real fragrance. The kind of floral arrangement that costs somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 depending on the season, and in late April in Chicago, you're paying the higher end. I know that because I priced them once. For a wedding I thought I might plan someday. For a life I thought I was building. The string quartet was playing Debussy. The candles on every table were ivory pillar candles, 3 heights, clustered in groups of 5, and the light they threw across the room was the specific golden color that makes everyone look softer than they are. 200 guests. Crystal glassware. A 5-course menu printed on cardstock thick enough to use as a bookmark. It was genuinely the most beautiful event I had ever attended, and I had been sitting in it for 4 hours at a table near the kitchen, carrying a secret that could end everything in this room. The flowers, the music, the careful golden light, all of it, if I chose to use it. I hadn't decided yet. That's what I told myself. But if I'm being honest with you, and I promised myself this story would be honest, I think I had already decided. I think I had decided the moment I closed my brother's laptop 23 days earlier and sat alone in my parents' kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, understanding for the first time the actual shape of the last 3 years of my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what I knew sitting at that table, you need to understand what he took. And to understand what he took, you need to understand who we were before he started taking. Chapter 2. The Golden Son and the Invisible Daughter. My name is Maya. I'm 31 years old. I'm a senior data analyst at a logistics firm in Chicago, the kind of job that sounds boring at dinner parties but pays $94,000 a year and taught me, more than anything else in my life, how to find patterns in information that other people overlook. That skill, it turns out, is more useful outside the office than inside it. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, in a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street where my parents, both educators, both decent people, both profoundly human in their blind spots, raised 2 children with very different gravitational pulls. My brother Daniel is 3 years older than me. He is the kind of person rooms reorganize themselves around. Tall, articulate, quick with a joke and quicker with a compliment. The specific brand of charming that registers as warmth even when it isn't. He went to University of Illinois on a partial scholarship, graduated with honors, got a job in pharmaceutical sales that became a management role that became a regional director position by the time he was 29. He is, by every external measure, a success. Our family has always known this. Our family has always made sure Daniel knew they knew. I was not the black sheep. I want to be precise about that because the black sheep gets attention, gets drama, gets a role in the family story even if it's an unflattering one. I was something quieter. I was the other one. The background character. The one you mention after you finish talking about Daniel. Let me give you 3 examples. Because data means nothing without examples. When I was 16, I won a regional science competition. A computational modeling project that my teacher called the most sophisticated student submission she had seen in 11 years of judging. The competition was on a Saturday morning in March. My parents did not attend. Daniel had a JV basketball game the same day. They chose the game. I took the bus home alone with my trophy and a certificate signed by the county superintendent of schools. The trophy sat on a shelf in the garage for 11 years before it was thrown away during a house move. I found out about the move after it happened. When I was 24, I was accepted to Northwestern's Data Science Graduate Program. Full scholarship. Competitive program. The kind of acceptance that required 3 recommendation letters, a research proposal, and a portfolio review. I called my mother from my car because I was too excited to wait. She said, and I remember this precisely, "That's wonderful, honey. Did Daniel tell you about his promotion?" My father took Daniel to a steakhouse that Friday to celebrate the regional director role. I made pasta at my apartment and opened a bottle of wine that cost $14. I told myself it was enough. The 3rd example involves money. When my grandmother, my father's mother, A woman who worked as a seamstress for 40 years and saved with extraordinary discipline, passed away at 84. She left $40,000 in her will. Split equally, the will said, between her 2 grandchildren. Equal. The word was in the document. I received $12,000. Daniel received $28,000. When I asked my mother about the discrepancy, calmly with the actual will document in my hand, she looked at me with the specific exhausted expression she reserved for things she considered beneath resolution, and said, Daniel had some expenses. You're more independent. You understand. I did not understand. But I said nothing. Because I had been saying nothing my entire life and I was very good at it by then. What I was not good at, what nothing in my life had prepared me for, was discovering that the closed doors were not accidents. That someone had been standing on the other side of them, quietly, deliberately, turning the lock. Chapter 3. Every door had his fingerprints. It was a Tuesday, February 4th. 9:47 p.m. I know the time because I checked it afterward, the way you check the time after something happens that you know you will be describing for the rest of your life. I was at my parents' house for dinner. Daniel had left his MacBook Pro on the kitchen counter. The newer one, silver, with a Northwestern sticker on the back that always quietly annoyed me, because he'd been working there earlier and forgotten it in the rush of leaving. I needed to print a boarding pass for a work conference in Atlanta. My phone was at 4% battery. The laptop was right there already open. I touched the trackpad to wake the screen. The browser was open. Specifically, it was open to iMessage, the web version, the one that mirrors your phone, and the conversation visible on the screen was between Daniel and our mother. I should have closed it. I know that. I am aware of what I should have done. But the preview of the last message was visible before I could look away. And it contained my name. And it contained a word I would spend the next 23 days turning over in my mind like a stone with something living underneath it. Handled. I pulled out a chair and I sat down. And I read. The first message was about a job. Harman Analytics, a mid-size firm in the River North neighborhood. The kind of company that does sophisticated logistics work for healthcare clients. I had applied for a senior analyst position there 14 months earlier. Made it to the final round, for candidates one role, a panel interview with the VP of operations that I thought went genuinely well. Then a rejection email citing cultural fit concerns. I had cried about that rejection for a full week. I had spent 3 months replaying the interview, cataloging my answers, trying to identify the moment I had lost them. Daniel's message to our mother, dated 13 months ago, read, took care of the Harman thing. Called Greg directly. He owes me from the Midwest Conference referral. Told him Maya has a recurring pattern of workplace conflict and probably isn't the right fit for a senior role right now. He appreciated the heads up. She'll never know. Better for everyone. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because my brain was attempting to reject it the way a body rejects something foreign. Better for everyone. I sat with that phrase for approximately 90 seconds. Then I kept reading. The second message was about an apartment. Lakeview, a neighborhood in Chicago, 4 blocks from my parents' house. I had found a 1-bedroom there 2 years ago, $1,650 a month, ground floor of a 2-flat, hardwood floors, a small yard. I could afford it. My credit score at the time was 741. I had my first and last month's rent saved, plus the security deposit, in a separate account I had specifically built for that purpose. The landlord, a man named Pat, I still remember his voice, had called me on a Thursday morning to tell me my application had been declined due to credit concerns. I spent $300 in 4 months disputing a credit report that had nothing wrong with it. I never found an error because there wasn't one. I assumed it was a mistake in the landlord's screening software. I let it go. Daniel's message, dated 22 months ago, handled the Lakeview situation. Told the landlord she had a prior eviction in Wisconsin. A tenant-landlord dispute that got messy. She doesn't, obviously, but he won't verify beyond the call. Better she stays in her current place for now. She's too close to mom and dad when she's anxious and it creates problems. It's better this way. She's too close to mom and dad when she's anxious. He had decided. On my behalf. About my home. And then he had lied, clearly, specifically, consequentially, to a landlord, and I had spent $300 in 4 months trying to fix a problem he had deliberately manufactured. I was very still in that kitchen chair. I noticed I was very still, and I noted it the way you note a clinical detail about someone else, because the alternative was to feel it, and I could not feel it yet. The information was too large. I needed to finish reading first. The third message was about Marcus. I'm going to ask you to stay with me through this one, because this is the one that required the most from me to write, and it will require something from you to hear. Marcus and I were together for 2 years. He was a structural engineer, quiet and precise and funny in the specific way that only reveals itself slowly, over months of paying attention. We met at a friend's birthday dinner, talked until the restaurant closed, exchanged numbers in the parking lot in the rain. We were, for approximately 22 months, building something that felt like the foundation of a life. He ended it in a coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon. Shaking hands, kind eyes, the careful language of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. He told me he wasn't ready, that he needed space, that I deserved someone more certain. I actually thanked him for his honesty. I went home and sat on my bathroom floor for an hour, and then I washed my face and I went to work the next morning, because that is what I do. I blamed myself for 18 months. I cataloged everything I might have done wrong. I carried the weight of that relationship the way you carry something you don't understand you're not supposed to be carrying alone. Daniel's message to our mother, dated 26 months ago, 4 months before Marcus ended things, read: I had a conversation with Marcus last week. Told him some things about Maya's history, the anxiety, the dependency patterns, the way she gets when relationships get serious. Framed it as concern. He's a thoughtful guy, he took it seriously. I think he'll make the right decision on his own timeline. It's handled. She'll be upset for a while, but she's resilient. She always lands. I closed the laptop. I sat in my parents' kitchen for 47 minutes. I know it was 47 because I watched the clock on the microwave move from 9:53 to 10:40 without looking away from it. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs my mother was watching television. I could hear the faint sound of it through the ceiling. I printed my boarding pass from my phone, which had charged enough on the counter. I folded it, put it in my bag, let myself out the front door quietly, and I began on the drive home to count every other closed door in the last decade. Methodically, the way a data analyst counts, sorting them into 2 columns in my mind. Doors I closed myself. Doors that were closed for me. The second column was longer than I had ever allowed myself to suspect. I did not cry that night. I am telling you that not to sound strong. I am telling you that because I think the absence of tears was its own information. Something in me had moved past grief into something quieter and more purposeful. I had 23 days until my brother's wedding, and I had learned something over 31 years of watching Daniel operate that I was finally going to use. The most powerful move is always the one nobody sees coming. What they didn't know was I had already started. Chapter 4. The wedding I almost didn't attend. I almost didn't go. I want to be transparent about that. There was a version of this story where I stayed home, ordered takeout, watched something forgettable on my laptop, and let Daniel have his beautiful wedding in peace while I sat quietly with what I knew and figured out what to do with it alone. RSVP'd yes. Then I changed it to no. Then I called my mother and changed it back to yes because she cried, not dramatically, just the specific quiet crying she does when she feels the family is fracturing, and I have spent 31 years being unable to tolerate that sound. Some conditioning runs very deep. I chose the dress carefully. Dark emerald green, structured, the kind of dress that says I am not here to be pitied. I did my own hair. I drove myself. I arrived exactly on time. Not early, which would have suggested eagerness, and not late, which would have become a story. On time. Controlled. Deliberate. The venue was the Langham Hotel in downtown Chicago. $12,000 ballroom minimum. I looked it up later, though I already suspected from the moment I walked in. The kind of space that makes your footsteps sound important. Marble floors. 30-foot ceilings. The peonies I described at the beginning. Everywhere, in every corner, blush and ivory and real. My table assignment was number 14. I found this out at the seating display near the entrance. A beautiful acrylic board with calligraphy names and table numbers. I scanned for my name. Table 14. I pulled out my phone and opened the venue map they had included in the invitation. Table 14 was adjacent to the kitchen entrance. Not near the kitchen. Adjacent to it. The table where the catering staff passed every 7 minutes with trays and equipment. The table where the sound of the kitchen, the clatter, the brief cold draft every time the door swung open, was a constant presence. It was the table for people the host wanted to invite without wanting them to be seen. I found my seat. I sat down. I placed my clutch on the table and I looked out at the room, at tables 1 through 8, arranged in a horseshoe around the dance floor, glittering with the family and friends Daniel had chosen to keep close, and I breathed. In. Out. Controlled. The ceremony was in the hotel's garden terrace. It was genuinely moving. Emma was luminous, Daniel was polished, the officiant said something about partnership that made several people cry. I watched my brother's face as Emma walked toward him and tried to locate the person I knew inside the performance of the person he was presenting, and I could not find the seam. He was that good. The reception began at 6 p.m. At 6:23, during the cocktail hour, Daniel found me near the bar. He looked happy. That is the honest thing to say. He looked genuinely, expansively happy, the way people look when everything is going according to their architecture. Maya. He hugged me. Firm, brief, the hug of someone performing warmth for a nearby audience. You came. Of course, I said. He held me at arm's length and looked at me with a specific expression, fond, slightly pitying, the elder sibling surveying something smaller than itself, that I had been receiving from him since childhood. You look good, he said. Considering. One word. Casual. Devastating. Delivered with a smile so that anyone watching would see a brother paying his sister a compliment. I smiled back. Equally casual. Equally deliberate. You too, I said. Congratulations, Daniel. He squeezed my shoulder and moved on to the next cluster of guests, already laughing at something someone else had said, already fully present in the room he had built for himself. But that wasn't the moment. That was just the appetizer. The moment came at 7:15, during the formal dinner introductions, the part of the reception where the MC invites the wedding party and family members to be acknowledged. Standard practice. Warm celebratory brief. The MC called family members to stand as he named them. Daniel's parents, Robert and Patricia, married 38 years, the foundation of this family. Applause. My parents stood, beaming, my mother dabbing her eye with a handkerchief she had clearly prepared in advance. Daniel's extended family and close friends. Thank you all for traveling to celebrate. More applause. People waved from their tables. And Daniel's sister, Maya. I began to stand. Who Daniel describes. The MC smiled, reading from a note card that Daniel had clearly prepared and handed to him. As the family member who has always done things her own unique way. The one who took the road less traveled. And is still looking for the destination. Laughter. Warm, widespread, 200-person laughter. The kind that fills a 30-foot ceiling ballroom and hangs there. My mother smiled into her napkin. My father chuckled. I stood fully upright because I had started to stand and I refused to sit back down, and I smiled genuinely, I believe, because something in me had gone very calm. And I looked directly at Daniel. He was looking back at me. Still smiling. Perfectly composed. And then he leaned slightly toward Emma, said something in her ear, and she laughed softly, and he picked up his champagne glass and turned back to the room. I sat down. I picked up my own champagne glass. I drank it slowly, looking at table 14's centerpiece, a cluster of ivory peonies in a low crystal vase. And I thought about the employment attorney I had called 12 days ago. I thought about the recorded phone call with the landlord. I thought about what Marcus had said when I had asked him directly whether someone had spoken to him about me before he ended things. I thought about the folder on my laptop desktop labeled, with what I now recognized as appropriate irony, handled. He thought the note card was a warning. He was actually handing me the last piece I needed. Because in that moment, watching 200 people laugh at the girl from table 14, I stopped asking myself whether I was willing to use what I knew. I had my answer. Chapter 5. She came back a different color. Emma disappeared at 8:34 p.m. I know the time because I had been watching the evening with the particular attention of someone who is waiting for something without knowing exactly what form it will take. The cake had been cut. The photographs had been taken. I was in exactly 2 of them, both group shots, positioned at the end of the row nearest the edge of the frame. The string quartet had transitioned from dinner music to something softer, more ambient, filling the space between courses. The first dance was scheduled for 9 p.m. At 8:34, Emma excused herself from the head table. I watched her cross the room, unhurried, composed, the practiced movement of a woman who has spent the last 12 hours being watched by 200 people and has learned to move gracefully under observation. She disappeared through a side door near the floral installation on the east wall. 23 minutes passed. I know because I counted. When she came back, she was a different color. That is the only way I know how to say it. She had left the room ivory and gold, luminous, present, the specific radiance of a woman on her wedding day. And she returned the color of something that had been rinsed. Not pale from illness. Pale from information. There is a specific quality to the face of a person who has just learned something that rewrites what they thought they knew. And I recognized it immediately because I had worn it myself 47 days ago in my parents' kitchen. She moved through the room without looking at anyone. Directly, purposefully, as though she had coordinates. She was walking toward me. In a room of 200 people, past the head table where her new husband sat laughing with his groomsmen, past her own parents and bridesmaids and childhood friends. She crossed the entire reception hall and sat down in the empty chair beside me at table 14. She placed her phone on the table between us, screen up. I looked at it. It was a message thread. I messaged Blue Bubbles. Between Daniel, his contact name in her phone was D. Redheart, which struck me as unbearable in that moment, and Ryan, his best man. The messages were dated 4 months ago. She doesn't need to know about Lisbon, Daniel had written. What she doesn't know is a gift I'm giving her. What if she finds out? Ryan replied. She won't. And if she does, I'll handle it. I'm good at handling things. You know that. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Emma. Her eyes were dry. She was holding herself very still, with the rigid posture of someone managing something too large for the container of the moment. He used that word, she said. Her voice was almost conversational. Almost. Handle. He used that exact word about you too. I found messages in his email 3 weeks ago. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for a restaurant confirmation we'd both been copied on. And I saw your name. I didn't understand the context then. I closed it. She paused. Tonight I went back to look. I needed to understand what Lisbon was. And when I was in his email, I found the thread with your mother. My whole body went still. How much did you read? I asked. All of it, she said. The string quartet played something soft and unrecognizable behind us. You knew, Emma said. Not an accusation. A recognition, the specific tone of someone assembling a picture they had been looking at sideways. You came here today knowing something. I could see it when you walked in. I thought it was family tension. But you knew. Yes, I said. How long? 23 days. She absorbed that. Why didn't you say anything? I looked at her. At this woman in her extraordinary dress, peonies threaded through her hair, candlelight moving across her face, and I told her the truth. Because I knew that if I said it before you found it yourself, every person in this room would call it jealousy. Instability. The difficult sister making a scene at her brother's wedding. He had already built that narrative. I heard it in the MC's introduction tonight. He had prepared the room to discount me before I could speak. I held her gaze. I needed you to find it. I needed the information to come from somewhere he couldn't preemptively discredit. Emma was quiet for a long moment. What was Lisbon? I asked. She told me. I'm not going to share the details here. That is Emma's story to tell or not tell as she chooses, but I will say that it confirmed what the word handled had already suggested, that Daniel's management of the people in his life was not limited to his sister, that it was, in fact, a practiced and wide-ranging operational style. Then I told her what I hadn't told anyone: the job, the apartment, Marcus. All three, in order, with the specific language Daniel had used in the messages, the clinical administrative language of someone who genuinely did not experience what he was doing as cruelty, but as management. I watched Emma's face move through the information the way weather moves across an open field. Comprehension. Horror. The specific nausea of recognizing a pattern you have been living inside without knowing its name. When I finished, she reached across table 14 and took my hand. "What do I do?" she whispered. I thought about every closed door, every failure I had rebuilt myself around, every version of myself I had constructed from wreckage I hadn't known was manufactured. "Whatever you decide," I said, "decide it for yourself. Not for the room. Not for the dress. Not for the flowers or the string quartet or the 200 people on the other side of this ballroom." I squeezed her hand once. "You are allowed to choose yourself even here. Especially here." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked me one question I had not anticipated. "How long are you willing to wait for justice?" I looked back at her steadily. "I'm not waiting," I said. "I already started." Chapter 6. The trap was already set. Let me tell you what 23 days of silence looks like when it is not passive. The night I drove home from my parents' house, laptop closed, boarding pass folded, refrigerator hum fading behind me, I made one decision before I reached my apartment. I decided that I was not going to do what my brother had always counted on me doing, which was absorbing the information, grieving privately, and eventually returning to equilibrium having changed nothing and demanded nothing. I was going to be precise. I was going to be documented. And I was going to be patient. Day 1. I sat at my own kitchen table with the legal pad and wrote down every message I could remember from the screen, word for word, before the details blurred. Then I drove back to my parents' house the following afternoon. My mother was at her book club, my father at the gym, and I borrowed Daniel's laptop again. I told my father I had left a charger there. He waved me in without looking up from the television. The messages were still there. I photographed every relevant thread with my phone. Time-stamped. 3 copies, one in my iCloud, one in a Google Drive account I created specifically for this purpose under a name that was not mine, one airdropped to my work laptop and stored in an encrypted folder. A data analyst's first instinct is always backup. Day 4. I called an employment attorney named Patricia Osei, whose name I found through a colleague who had once navigated a workplace wrongful termination case. I did not tell her I was Daniel's sister. I told her I had documentation suggesting that a third party had made materially false statements to a prospective employer during my final round candidacy for a senior position, resulting in a demonstrably consequential rejection. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the statements in writing?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Time-stamped. "Yes. And you can demonstrate the causal relationship between the statements and the rejection?" "I can demonstrate that the statements were made to the hiring manager by someone who identified himself as a concerned professional contact, and that the rejection followed within 72 hours using language, cultural fit concerns. That is consistent with the characterization he provided." Another pause. "Come in Thursday," she said. Patricia Osei told me, in her office on Thursday afternoon, that what Daniel had done had a name: tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. She told me it was actionable in Illinois civil court. She told me the documentation I had would be, in her professional assessment, sufficient to file. She also told me to get one more thing if I could: confirmation from the hiring manager himself. I was already working on it. Day 7. Greg, the hiring manager at Harman Analytics, Daniel's contact, the man who had received the phone call, was findable on LinkedIn. I did not contact him directly. Instead, I reached out to the VP of Operations at Harman Analytics, a woman named Diane Marsh, whose name I found in the final round interview confirmation email I had saved in my archives. And I sent her a carefully written message. I told her I was following up on a candidacy from 14 months prior, that I had recently come into possession of information suggesting my rejection may have been influenced by a third-party communication containing false statements about my professional history, that I was not making an accusation and was not seeking to cause disruption. I was simply asking whether the hiring committee would be willing to confirm whether such a communication had been received. Diane Marsh replied in 4 hours. She asked me to call her directly. I will not share everything from that conversation, but I will tell you that Greg had mentioned the call to Diane at the time briefly as a heads up, the way you mentioned something that felt slightly off but not off enough to flag formally. And that Diane, upon reflection, remembered that the timing of the call and the language of the rejection email had struck her as slightly unusual, and that she was, upon learning the nature of what I was investigating, willing to provide a written statement. Day 9. I called the Lakeview landlord. Illinois is a one-party consent state for recorded phone calls. I looked this up before I dialed. I told Pat, the landlord, the man who had declined my application 22 months ago, that I was calling regarding a rental application I had submitted for his Lakeview property, that I was conducting a personal review of a credit matter from that period, and wanted to understand the basis for the denial. Pat was a straightforward man. He remembered the property. He remembered the application. He remembered the phone call he had received, unsolicited, from a man who identified himself as a family friend with relevant background information about the applicant. He had not verified the eviction claim. He had taken the call at face value because the caller sounded credible and because, as he said, "It's not worth the risk when you've got other applicants." I asked if he would be willing to provide that account in writing, in the context of a potential legal matter. He said he would. He sounded actually relieved, the specific relief of someone who had made a decision based on false information and had occasionally wondered about it since. I thanked him and ended the call. 12 minutes later, I sent the recording to Patricia Osei. Day 14. Marcus. I had been saving this one. Not because it was the most legally significant, it was arguably the least, since the interference in a personal relationship is harder to litigate than professional or financial sabotage, but because it was the most personally costly, and I needed to be in the right state of mind to do it without losing my composure. I sent him a text. 9 words. I need one honest conversation. Can we do that? He called me within the hour. I did not record it. This one was not for the folder. This one was for me. I asked him directly, calmly, without accusation, using the specific careful language of someone who already knows the answer and is simply inviting confirmation, whether anyone had spoken to him about me before he ended our relationship. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted 11 seconds. I counted. "Maya," he said finally. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before, something adjacent to shame. I think I made a very serious mistake. He told me what Daniel had said. The anxiety framing, the dependency characterization, the way it had been delivered, as concern, as one man looking out for another, as the kind of private warning that feels like a gift in the moment and only reveals its actual nature years later when you're sitting on the other end of a phone call understanding what you were actually handed. "I should have come to you," Marcus said. "I should have asked you directly. I didn't. And I've thought about that." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to handle it," I said. And I ended the call. Day 19. Daniel's company, the pharmaceutical firm where he was regional director, had a corporate ethics and compliance department, standard for any mid-size pharma operation. I knew this because I had looked them up. I also knew, because I had looked carefully at the message screenshots, that Daniel had used his corporate email address in at least 2 of the communications. Not his personal Gmail. His work email. With his company's domain. I drafted a letter to the Ethics and Compliance Department. I did not send it yet. I dated it, saved it, added it to the folder. The folder now contained 3 sets of time-stamped message screenshots, 1 attorney consultation with follow-up notes, one written statement from a hiring manager, one recorded landlord call with transcript, one personal witness account from Marcus, summarized in writing while the details were fresh, and one drafted compliance letter waiting. I named the folder on the morning of day 19 the same thing Daniel had named his methods. Handled. Day 23. The wedding. I drove to the Langham Hotel in my emerald dress with the folder backed up in 4 locations and Patricia Osei's number in my recent calls. I sat at table 14. I listened to the MC read the note card Daniel had prepared. I watched 200 people laugh. I picked up my champagne glass and I drank slowly and I thought, I have built a room. I have furnished every corner of it. I have checked every door and every lock. All that remains is for Daniel to walk inside. And at 8:34 p.m., when Emma excused herself from the head table and crossed the room toward me 23 minutes later, a different color, I understood that the room had found its first occupant. And it was not the one I had been expecting. Chapter 7. What happened after the music stopped? The string quartet played until 10 p.m. I know because I stayed. I want to be clear about that. I did not leave early, did not cause a scene, did not walk to the head table and place a printed folder in front of my brother between the salad course and the entree. I stayed until the music stopped and the candles burned low and the 200 guests began collecting their coats and their favors and filing out into the Chicago night. I hugged my mother at the door. I shook my father's hand. I told Daniel, who embraced me with the broad, satisfied warmth of a man who believed the evening had gone exactly as planned, that it had been a beautiful wedding. It really was, I said. And I meant it. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I looked at the folder labeled handled for a long time. Then I went to bed. Because the work was not done in a night. And I had learned from watching my brother operate for 31 years, that the people who move too fast leave evidence of their urgency. I was not going to be urgent. I was going to be methodical. The first week after the wedding, Emma called me on a Monday morning, 6 days after the reception. She had spent those 6 days, her honeymoon week, the week that was supposed to be Santorini and room service and the particular happiness of beginning, at her parents' house in Winnetka instead. She had not gone to Santorini. She had spoken to a family law attorney. I want to be careful here about what I share and what I protect, because Emma's decisions belong to Emma, and I am not the narrator of her marriage. What I will tell you is this. She made her choices clearly, deliberately, and entirely for herself. Not for the room. Not for the dress. Exactly as I had suggested she was allowed to. Daniel called me 4 times in that first week. I did not answer. On the 5th call he left a voicemail. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. A tightness, a slight unevenness, the sound of a man who had walked into a room and found it furnished in ways he had not anticipated. Maya, I don't know what you said to Emma, but I need you to call me back. This is whatever you think timestamped, reviewed by people who did not love him and were not managed by him. What the company chose to do with that information was their decision. What they chose to do, I learned 4 weeks later through a source I will not name, was open a formal internal investigation into misuse of corporate communication channels. Daniel was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. At the end of it he was not terminated. I told you I was not trying to destroy him, and I mean that, but he was formally disciplined, required to complete ethics training, and removed from his regional director role. He was reassigned to an individual contributor position, with a 23% salary reduction. 23%. I did not plan that number. But I noted it. Week 4. Patricia Osei filed the civil complaint for tortious interference with prospective economic advantage in Cook County Circuit Court. Named defendants. Daniel, in his personal capacity, for the communication to the Harman Analytics hiring manager. Supporting documentation. The hiring manager's written statement. The timestamped screenshots. The timeline correlation between Daniel's communication and my rejection. Patricia's legal brief. which was 31 pages and which I read in full on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of tea and the particular satisfaction of watching something you built from raw materials become a finished structure. Daniel's personal attorney, he retained one within 48 hours of receiving the filing, attempted to characterize the screenshots as fabricated. This position became difficult to maintain once the hiring manager's written statement was entered into the record. It became impossible to maintain once Daniel's own corporate email server logs, subpoenaed as part of the internal company investigation, confirmed the communication. 14 weeks after the filing, Daniel's attorney approached Patricia O'Shea with a settlement offer. We countered. They accepted the counter. The settlement amount is subject to a confidentiality agreement that I will honor. What I will tell you is that it was sufficient to cover the salary differential between my current position and the Harman Analytics senior role, projected across 3 years, plus legal fees, plus an additional amount that Patricia described as appropriate given the documented nature and duration of the conduct. I donated 10% of it to a workforce development nonprofit on the north side of Chicago that helps women re-enter professional fields after career disruption. I thought that was the right place for it. The landlord. The Lakeview situation did not result in litigation. What it resulted in was a written apology from the landlord, genuinely remorseful, I believe, in the way that people are genuinely remorseful when they understand they were used as an instrument, and a formal retraction of the declined application filed with the tenant screening bureau that had recorded it. The retraction cost me nothing and took 3 weeks to process. The Lakeview apartment had long since been rented to someone else. That was fine. I was not trying to recover the apartment. I was trying to recover the record. My credit report, which had carried a soft notation from the screening inquiry for nearly 2 years, was cleared. I found a different apartment. River North. 14th floor. A view of the city that I sometimes stand at for 10 minutes in the morning with my coffee, not thinking about anything in particular, just looking. It costs more than $1,650 a month. I can afford it. Marcus. This one I will keep short because it is the most private and because the outcome is not what you might expect, and I think that is actually the point. Marcus and I did not get back together. I want to be clear about that. This is not that kind of story, and I am not that kind of narrator. We had one more conversation in person at a coffee shop that was not the one where he had ended things. He told me everything Daniel had said. He told me he was sorry. He told me he had wondered in the months after the breakup whether he had made a mistake, but that by the time the wondering had become something he might act on, too much time had passed. I told him I understood. I told him that what Daniel had done to our relationship was Daniel's crime, not his failure, that he had been given false information by someone he had no reason to distrust, and that I had spent too long assigning myself blame for a fracture that was manufactured. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about it honestly. I'm getting there, I said. For the first time in a while, I'm actually getting there. We shook hands in the parking lot. It was not raining this time. Some things don't return to what they were. That doesn't make them losses. Sometimes it makes them completions. The family dinner. 6 weeks after the wedding. A Sunday. My parents' house in Evanston. I arrived with a folder. Printed. 1 copy for each person present, my mother, my father, and Daniel, who had been told by our mother that I wanted to have a family conversation and who arrived, I think, believing he could manage whatever was coming. I placed a copy in front of each of them without speaking. I sat down. I waited while they read. My mother reached the Marcus message first. I watched her face. She set the paper down and looked at her hands. My father read more slowly, methodically. When he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the table, and did not put them back on for the rest of the evening. Daniel read his copy the way you read something you already know the contents of but are hoping has somehow changed since you last saw it. It hadn't changed. The silence lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then my mother said, quietly, not defensively, not the way I had expected her to speak, I didn't know about Marcus. Or the apartment. I looked at her. You knew about the job, I said. She didn't answer. Which was its own answer. My father looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. And then my father said something I had never heard him say in 31 years of being his daughter, in 31 years of science trophies left in garages and celebrations attended alone and inheritance distributed unequally with a casual wave of a hand. You owe your sister an accounting. A real one. Not a voicemail. Daniel did not speak for a long time. When he did, what he said was not an apology. It was the beginning of one halting incomplete, the first draft of something that would take much longer to become real, if it ever did. I did not require it to be finished in that kitchen. I did not require it to be anything other than what it was. I was not there for his apology. I was there so that the truth existed in that room. So that my parents had seen it in print in Daniel's own words with his own timestamps. So that the version of me that had lived in that house, the background character, the other one, the girl at table 14, was no longer the only version available. I drove home that night on the I-94 with the windows down despite the cold. It was the first time in 3 years that the drive felt like moving towards something rather than away. Where I am now. I am going to tell you this part simply because I think it is the most important part and I don't want to dress it up. I am still at the same logistics firm. I am being considered for a senior director role. A conversation that began with some irony, around the same time the Harmon Analytics situation resolved. I live in my 14th floor apartment in River North. I have a plant on the windowsill that I have kept alive for 7 months, which is a personal record. I speak to my mother once a week. My father and I have had 3 conversations in the last 2 months that did not involve Daniel, which is more than we had in the previous 2 years combined. It is not a repaired relationship. It is the beginning of one, built differently than the original, on more honest ground. Daniel and I do not speak. I do not know if that will change. I hold the possibility of it the way you hold something fragile, carefully, without gripping, available to set down if it needs to be set down. Emma and I have coffee occasionally. She is doing well. That is her story to tell and I will leave it there. Except to say that she is one of the most quietly courageous people I have ever met, and that I am glad we found each other at table 14. I used to believe that the opposite of being invisible was being seen. I used to think that what I needed, what would fix the particular ache of being the background character in your own family's story, was for the people who had looked past me to finally look directly at me and acknowledge what they had missed. I was wrong about that. The opposite of being invisible is not being seen by the people who refuse to look. The opposite of being invisible is building something so documented, so precise, so undeniably real, that the architecture of your actual life becomes impossible to edit, impossible to manage, impossible to handle. Daniel spent 3 years quietly dismantling the structure of my life, because he believed I would never look closely enough at the wreckage to find his fingerprints. He was right for a long time. He was right until a Tuesday night in February when a refrigerator hummed and a laptop screen glowed, and a data analyst sat down in a kitchen chair and started doing what she had always been trained to do. Finding patterns, documenting evidence, building a case. I am not going to tell you I have forgiven everything. I am not there yet and I think pretending otherwise would be dishonest, and I promised you at the beginning that this story would be honest. What I will tell you is this. I am no longer building my life around the question of why the people who were supposed to see me chose not to. I am building it around what I can see clearly now, which turns out to be quite a lot, once you stop standing in rooms where the lighting was designed to make you disappear. I built my own table. Every seat at it was filled by someone who chose to be there. And nobody, not one single person sitting at it, was invited by Daniel. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever sat at a table that was designed to make you feel small, in a room that was arranged to make you invisible, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what is the one door in your life that you are finally ready to look at more closely? If you are new here, welcome. This channel is for people who are done being handled. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most powerful move is always the one nobody sees coming. I'll see you in the next one.